LSP Board of Directors meeting for February 13th, 2018. Can I get everybody to please stand and join me for the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We'll determine the voting member this morning. Ms. Anderson?
Present.
Tommy Clay is absent. John Priestman is here. Mr. Fagley?
Present.
Barry Moldenhauer? Here. Mr. Myers?
Here.
Mr. Nelson?
Present.
Derek Tremaine is out. Agenda item number 2 is the meeting minutes from January 9th, 2018. Being no errors or omissions, we accepted a motion to accept.
Motion to accept the minutes from our last meeting.
Motion, Mr. Nelson.
Second.
Second, Mr. Fagley. Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Mr. Travis. This is the fun part of the board meetings. Very lucky to have another long-time employee here, Travis Ball, recognition of his 15 years of service as an employee of the Okeechobee Utility Authority. On behalf of the board and myself, we're really proud of you and we're glad you're here for another 15 years. Thank you, sir. That's the check, and we're available for lunch if you'd like to take us. Here's the certificate turnaround. What you could be taking. Thank you, Travis. Thanks, sir. Moving on, agenda item number 4, the consent agenda. It's the board's pleasure.
I make a motion to accept the consent agenda.
Motion by Mr. Nelson to accept the consent agenda.
Second.
Second, Mr. Fagley. Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Consent agenda is approved. All right, all the way down to 11.
We have Rory Hamilton with Public Resource Management Group here this morning to do the presentation of the financial forecast update that was included in your board packages. As you look through it, there would certainly be several scenarios that we would look at that we went through with staff and with CRD, both the base case for no capital expansion as well as into big capital expansion. 6 other scenarios with varying cost benefits either through grants or assessments. So we'll be happy to entertain questions during the presentation or after, and respond accordingly. So without further ado, Mr. Murray is here to go through this presentation.
Good morning, sir.
Morning. Thank you. Morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Again, for the record, my name is Murray Hamilton. I'm an associate with Public Resources Management Group. We're a utility rate and financial consulting firm headquartered in Maitland, Florida. The last opportunity I had to meet with y'all was back in September when we were here presenting a study based on a payback analysis, if you will, where we evaluated the feasibility of roughly 15 projects, and we tried to prioritize them over a period of time. And in doing so, we looked at the incremental approach that each one of those expansion-related projects had on the system and the benefits that they may have provided or costs. At the conclusion of that presentation, we determined that the Treasure Island project, when compared to the project pool, was the most advantageous. And so staff asked me to update the overall financial forecast of the utility system. And in that, we've done it in basically 2 steps. We've looked at a business as usual, or what we're calling the base case, which is what your system needs are before you consider any expansion program. And then, as Mr. Hayford pointed out, we then looked at some incremental adjustments for the overall Treasure Island project. And again, under multiple scenarios.
Always done. We're all subject to it.
That's why I have my paper and handout. Again, some of the major issues of the study, very little growth in the system recently. We're not planning on that to change very much in the next 5-year period, although we do have some water-only customers from Whispering Pines that are going to be added to the system. There's approximately $11.5 million worth of capital projects that need to be addressed over the next 6 years. So we've developed a capital funding plan, if you will, to help address those needs. As I know you're probably aware that the adopted budget that the staff put forth for this current year did plan on using some reserves in order to help fund those capital needs just in this first year. And then lastly, the third bullet is more of a ratio. It's a compliance issue. And when we talk about net revenues and debt service coverage, we're talking about the pledged revenues of your utility system after payment of operating expense and how much money is then left over to meet your senior lien and your junior lien debt. And what we're seeing here in the short term is by year 3, roughly in fiscal year 21, we currently don't think that the revenues are going to be adequate to meet those minimum requirements, even though the system will most likely have cash in the bank to make the payment. So this is a covenant compliance issue that's tied to the system's existing debt covenants. Study tasks, again, we're going to principally be focused on cash flow, cash balance of the system, which is tied to the board's policies regarding its cash reserves, as well as debt service coverage ratio that I mentioned before. As I said, we developed a capital financing plan. We're going to look at the needs over the next 6-year period. Specifically, we're looking at testing the compliance to those lending agreements, and we have at least made an estimate of what we think the future rate adjustments may be. We've taken a pass at developing a case in order to phase in those rate increases over time. And then, as I've mentioned before, we're going to look at the Treasure Island cases. I am going to try and go through this fairly quickly. I've worked with y'all now for almost 13 years. I know that we've evaluated Treasure Island several times. We've regularly given forecast updates to the system. Our last study, the system last increased its monthly rates for service back in 2011. So this is considerable that you've been able to go this long without a rate increase. Principally, that is a result of your 2012 study that we worked with staff, where you looked at retiring and reducing some of your principal debt that was out there. And that, in many respects, helped you make it this far without a rate increase. So now we're coming back, we're reevaluating the needs. We're going to be looking at customer and sales, operating expense, the capital needs that we talked about. There are certain transfer requirements that are tied to your bond resolutions and bank notes, as well as your own cash reserve policies. And again, lastly, we're going to look at what the rate increase needs are over the next 6 years. Just a description of the base case. Again, this is our business as usual. It's revenues under your current rate structure and current rates. We're, again, counting on very modest growth over the next few years. No major incremental operating expenses to speak of. It excludes any of your expansion-related projects that we're talking about, specifically Treasure Island. We're not assuming any new debt for the next 6-year period, so the capital needs are principally being funded with operating reserves and future rate revenues. Now, that doesn't preclude you from taking advantage of changing market conditions when you have an opportunity to refund a portion of your current debt. The revenue assumptions for our base case, We're recognizing the remaining installments due from the 1020 development. So that goes back, that's one of our legacy issues. We have those 1020 payments, installment revenues that are coming in. We've counted on those being collected over the next couple of years. Again, infill growth about 0.25% per year, very modest. I'll point out, historically, you've grown at 0.7. So even this 0.25% customer growth, it's tied to your budget. It's a budget basis, which is fairly conservative. So we're trying to look in that kind of format. Again, Whispering Pines, we anticipate to come on in 2019. It's about 160 water-only connections. It'll provide about $70,000 a year in additional revenue to the water system. So we are counting on that. Again, revenues at existing rates, last adjusted in 2011. Now, there are some discounts that are in effect today. There are fees that have been discounted 75%. It's for the connection fees, the capital connection charges, which are traditionally the impact fees of the system that are paid by new development, and the accrued guaranteed revenue charges. Now, as I understand it, those discounts are geared to sunset at the end of the year and would be restated back to the January 2016 level. Now, just to be conservative in our analysis, because we don't know the will of the board at this point until the end of the year, we've assumed that those discounts are going to be extended. I will say this, in terms of our base case, it has a very marginal impact because we're really not counting on a lot of significant growth over the period. Slide 7 is a projection of the gross revenues. Again, this is without any rate increases over the 6-year period. There's a slight step up in revenue in the first year from Whispering Pines, as well as in your budget document, we're planning on a small transfer to your rate stabilization fund in this current budget year, and that's a deduct from revenue. So it's a contra revenue, it's a negative revenue, and so beyond 18, we don't have that negative revenue anymore, and so you see that slight step up. Again, over the 5-year period, the average increase in revenues is about 0.25% per year on average. Operating expenses. It's really good to say OUA has a very strong relationship between its budget and the actual results. You know, when I look at all the other municipal systems that we have out there, they have fairly high budget to actual variances over time. Now, there's some reasons for that, and a lot of it may have to do with unfilled but budgeted positions and those kinds of things. But OUA has a really tight relationship with its operating expenses. So with that said, we've principally assumed that our forward-looking expenses are going to be based on the budget. We do recognize that there's a slight surplus most of the time at the end of the year. We're going to count on that a little bit, about $250,000 a year in surplus that we can apply towards some of the capital projects that we have that are out there. One of the subsequent events that I was made aware of after we developed this presentation is the system may have about $300,000 in some hurricane-related expenses that will need to be booked at some point during this fiscal year 18. Our understanding is, one, that those expenses would be capitalized, so then they shouldn't hit the income statement, if you will, and that most likely they would be funded with reserves that are already in the bank today. Forward-looking, we've had to make some assumptions, some planning criteria about operating expenses in the future. You can see our planning criteria. The next slide probably tells you a little bit better what all this means, but we go through the budget document by line item. We have to make certain assumptions about what those expenses are going to do over time. Labor and benefits is the largest item. We're planning on 3% a year on average. That could be a combination of a merit versus a price index, CPI, or cost of living. Health insurance, we're assuming that that's going to be managed within your recovery process that you do with staff. And you can see some other nominal increases. Probably the larger one is our exposure to electric and gas prices. And, you know, nobody has a crystal ball. We don't know what really that's going to happen over time. But we would adjust that by 5% plus any growth in the system. The overall CPI is estimated at 2.4%, and that comes to us from the Congressional Budget Office. On slide 9 is a projection of the operating expenses. this is really only about 65% of the budget. So it doesn't tell the whole story, and we're going to talk about the other components here in a minute. The average increase in O&M is estimated at 3% per year on average. So when we weight all those factors in, over the forecast period. The capital plan, $11.5 million, and we have a schedule in here on how we plan to fund the capital projects over the next 6 years. The total is $11.5 million. Now, the feedback, I'm not an engineer, but the feedback I'm getting back from our communities that are dealing with capital today is once they go out to bid, they're seeing that a lot of their estimated costs are too low, even to the tune of 15 to 20% too low. And so while we recognize that staff has made some allowances and contingencies for the costs that are in the capital plan, we've done the same thing, okay, in terms of how we put the numbers together. So we're hoping that we have a well-balanced capital plan once you have to go out and actually construct these projects. 70% of this plan, about $8 million, is tied up in the water treatment plant storage tank, and principally the water line replacements and extensions, as well as the sewer system rehabilitation. So 70% is geared towards those items of replacement. There's no new debt assumed. So again, we've got good, healthy cash reserve funds that are going to help us fund a good bit of this capital plan. And that's what's kind of summarized here on slide 11. This is a combination of reserves that are in the bank today, as well as future revenues over the 5 to 6 year period. 83% of this capital plan is funded with either cash in the bank today or through a revenue stream over the next few years. We are counting on some use of capital connection charges, $1.4 million. Again, those are the fees that are paid by future growth into the fund, and we've got a number of those that are actually in the bank today. We've got a small CDBG grant, which I think is tied to Whispering Pines. Again, most of it is reserves and rates. What I like about slide 12 is that, this is where it comes back to what do we need to fund annually from our ratepayers. Okay, we recognize that we have cash in the bank today that's going to be used to fund one-time expenditures, and that's what we've done within that whole $11.5 million plan. But what do we need to have from ratepayers on a recurring basis to help meet the capital project needs? And that's what slide 12 is. And so it's a combination of renewal and replacement of water lines, of lift station rehab, and those kinds of things. It also addresses any vehicle and other equipment replacements, computers that have to be replaced over the study period. The average for the 6-year period is just a little more than $500,000 a year. It's 5% of the revenues. So this is your system reinvestment. And in talking with staff, we think that is adequate at that level, specifically based on what OUA has invested in its system over the last few years. You've done some significant rehabilitation, and so that's why we think we can adequately fund our needs over the next 6 years at about 5% a year of your revenue. Again, the debt service on slide 13, we're not projecting any additional debt. Again, this is related to the base case only. Once we get to the expansion-related case, we would have to look at some SRF funding, potentially. The cash reserve policies, this is a combination of what's specified in your bond resolution, your lending agreements, as well as board-adopted policies. Okay, so not all of this is specifically tied to your bond resolution, but the need to maintain your renewal and replacement fund balance. This is a separate escrow that you set aside that's equal, again, to 5% of your gross revenues. It's about $500,000 a year. You have monies that you set aside in the emergency fund and the operating reserve fund. Collectively, there are about 120 days of operating expense, a really good target, especially when we have to go to SRF, or we may have to go to a local bank or the bond market for future financing. This will put you in a good, strong position. Also, it provides you some flexibility in addressing unforeseen capital needs that may come up. Rate stabilization fund, there is a policy where if you have a surplus in a given year, the board could elect to move a portion of that surplus to a rate stabilization fund. And if I recall correctly, by policy, the board put a maximum cap of not more than $3 million. Well, in our study period, principally to help fund that water storage tank, we're going to use the funds that are in the rate stabilization fund to pay a portion of that water storage tank. There's other funds that are going in there too, other operating reserve funds that are going to pay for that. Our intent is not to replenish the rate stabilization fund over the next 5 years. We would have to raise rates higher than what we've estimated in order to put money away to the rate stabilization fund. With that said, as you complete each year and you report your actual results, to the extent you have a surplus, you do have some flexibility to reuse that fund. So we're not eliminating the provision, is my point. Lastly, the debt service sinking fund. Again, you are required to set aside in each month an amount for your principal and interest payments on your current debt. Slide 15, it says required transfers. Again, these are the transfers that are tied to the cash reserve balances. We got to keep them at a 30-day and 90-day level for our emergency and operating reserve fund. We've got our R&R fund requirement. In reality, staff, in conjunction with the board, looks at these balances during the budget process. You may recall in your budget book, there's actually a schedule for each one of these funds in there. And I know that George and previously Basil had put a reconciliation in there of what those balances are going to be. That's what these transfers are. So these transfer needs, you're going to have some flexibility over the next 4 or 5 years about what you do or do not have to move into those funds. But based on our study assumptions, these are the needs that we see. Slide 16 is a projection of the cash flows over the study period. The cumulative deficiency by the last year is approximately $900,000 per year by that last year. It's 9% of rates. Our projected rate plan is actually something less than 9%, and I'll talk with you about that here in a second. The critical item is really the debt service coverage ratio. And so again, this is the pledged revenue after operating expenses, and in this case, after payment of your senior lien debt and what's left over for the junior lien debts, your SRF loans. And the criteria that we're not meeting in this formula by FY21 is where I've circled, it's that 100%. The board has adopted a policy to achieve at least a 120. And that shows up in your budget document. So the board specified a target of 120. Our minimum requirement, according to our loan agreement with SRF, is 115. And we're showing that if we do not adjust rates by the third year, that we're going to be slightly less than, just equal to, that debt service payment, which tells us we wouldn't have any money left over for the system after making that debt service payment. We would not be able to reinvest any monies into our capital infrastructure. Study considerations, again, when we look at the R&R needs of the capital, it makes good sense to fund it on a recurring basis through rates. That's what we've done in the past. It's the best way to keep the rates lowest in the long term. We've got to meet those minimum cash reserve provisions, not only the ones specified in the bond resolutions, but the ones that this board has adopted. And of course, we want to at least exceed the minimum debt service coverage requirement, but specifically, our goal is to hit at least your target of 120%. Slide 19 is one of many cases that could be developed. This is the base case. In my mind, because it's always the question I get, what's the least I can do now over the long term? And so that's why this plan was laid out the way it was, where it's really flat. It's the marginal that you could do. You wouldn't want to do nothing for the next 2 years and then have a much larger rate increase in FY21. You could do a little bit more sooner. And to be honest with you, that's what this board has done in the past. They might look at this rate plan and say, well, we might look at a 3% rate increase in year 1, look at it in year 2, possibly in year 3, and come back and revisit. And that's what this plan is meant to be. It's meant to be dynamic. something that you can come back and readdress. But I just want to let you know, this is just one of many cases. We just wanted to have something that we can talk about as a group. The overall projection would increase the bill approximately 7.5%, roughly, over the five-year period. This would start in FY19. October 1 is the starting date. Now, we do have some flexibility in that, too, by the way. We've restated what our base case description is here. Now, what this means in terms of your average customer bill using 4,000 monthly gallons is if we increased every single one of these rates over the years, on average, the bill would go up about $1.30 a month each year over the 5-year period. That's what the 1.5% rate increase is. I would point out that you do have a large number of customers that are water service only. And in their case, they wouldn't see a $1.30 increase per year. They would see about a 60-cent increase per year, about half, a little less than half. But again, that's what the numbers are telling us in terms of the base case. The results of that base case are shown on slide 20 and 21. Slide 20, we almost get to a perfect break even. The item that's not covered in that last year are some of those required transfers. Again, these are the transfers where this board has some discretion about the monies that they may move over in that last year. And then specifically, item 21 is your debt service coverage ratios. And the one that we were tight on, if your copy's in color, is the green bar. And you can see we're now, the lowest we're at is 132%, and that's by the last year. So in the base case, just to be specific, we didn't target a 120 coverage under the base case. Under the base case, we targeted a well-balanced funding plan to address all the cash flow and capital needs that we've outlined for the 6-year period. By fully funding the needs, by default, we ended up with a good ratio. Does that make sense? But by default, we've met our covenant. Where when we get to the Treasure Island scenarios, coverage is a lot more important there because we're taking on additional debt. And in that particular case, we are having to target just the bare minimum in order to meet the needs of those plans. Cash reserves is shown on slide 22. You can see again today we've got a healthy balance in 2017. What I would really call this, instead of calling this cash balance, this is really appropriated balance. Okay, I recognize that the actual cash spending curve may not mirror this presentation here. At some point, these capital projects will be payables, and then those payables will get paid at some point. They may overlap over fiscal years. So just because you may not get to a specific point at the end of 18 or 19 doesn't necessarily mean that you're off plan. This is appropriate. What balance is unappropriated at the end of each year? As you can see by the last year of the study period, the black bar is our targeted reserves. This is the emergency and the operating fund reserve. That's the total of 120 days. And it's the sum of the blue, red, and green bars, the columnar bars at the right. And so you can see we just have a marginal surplus just above that minimum criteria. So again, we've got positive cash flow. We're still maintaining our cash balances, and then we've met our covenant requirements for our future, our existing debt, I should say. So in the second step of our study, as Mr. Hafer pointed out, we looked at 6 scenarios. These are somewhat similar to what we looked back in September. But I'll be honest with you, if you try to lay them up side by side, there's some different criteria that we had to analyze. Different levels of grants, different levels of assessments. And just more and more as we got into the details of what the project were, we had to make some different assumptions. And a lot about what's in this packet here is to at least lay out all the assumptions on paper so that we've got a talking point that we can come back to as this project matures, as it moves forward. So the Treasure Island and Eastside Force Main project, the total project is roughly $27 million. It's comprised of the Eastside Force Main of $7.8 million, of which a portion of the Eastside Force Main is allocated to Treasure Island, and a larger portion is allocated to future growth. Okay? Then we have the Treasure Island collection system that only benefits Treasure Island customers in that area, $16 million. It'll serve roughly 2,400 connections. And then the on-site customer connection costs, again, this is Treasure Island specific, is about $3.5 million. And we've got a breakdown of what all these costs are comprised. They're in the back of the document, and you can see that. So, again, we addressed the feasibility of 6 scenarios. Lastly, how we've chosen to look at funding this is through the state revolving fund loan. These are junior lien pledges against the system. You have existing SRF debt today, so this is a process that staff is familiar with. We're assuming a 20-year loan schedule. Under certain considerations, OUA could qualify for a 30-year financing. We've assumed the rate of 1%, and as you can see there, the current rate is about 0.5%. Who knows what's going to happen with interest rates? What I would say about the SRF loan program, that's important, is one, you cannot start incurring expenses until you've received a notice to proceed. I think it's called a notice to incur costs. So you have to have that first, or otherwise your reimbursements will not be reimbursed. And then the second piece is, oftentimes, whatever the interest rate is today, the project remains open until the project is completed, and SRF at least has an opportunity to adjust the interest rate at the closing. With that said, you're still going to find that the interest rates under the SRF program are 40 to 60% of the market rate, what you might find in the bonding markets. Okay. So again, some of the assumptions tied to Treasure Island, revenues and expenses are again tied to the base case, but we did add some additional personnel costs, roughly 2 maintenance personnel over the study period beginning in the 3rd year, fiscal year 21. That's about the time we expect the project to be completed. It's $100,000 a year in estimated costs. The construction is anticipated to be done in 19 and 20. Again, with the first connection starting in 21. With that said, so how we've constructed our assumptions is while we're bringing the customers on in FY21, any assessment that's tied to those customers would also start in FY21. And the way we structure the debt with SRF would not be, the first payments would not be due until 21. Okay, because again, SRF is a program where you can draw those funds, and then once the project is completed, they give you 6 months before the first biannual payment is due. So everything is really occurring in that 3rd year, if you will, in terms of the overall revenues and expenses. During our 6-year period through FY23, we're assuming that no more than 60% of the Treasure Island customers will actually physically connect to the system. Long term, beyond year 5, which is outside of our forecast period, we're at least assuming that not more than 75%. There's going to be some marginal amount of customers that may never physically connect to the system. So now, what this next slide kind of helps us address the different scenarios that we're going to discuss here in a minute. We're not going to have 2 assessments. So I don't want this slide to suggest that OUA is looking at having 2 separate assessments. What we did is for all 6 cases, we've looked at a minimum special assessment of $2,402 per connection. Okay, and what that addresses is it addresses the on-site customer costs, the $3.5 million that I spoke about a moment ago, and the recovery of the capital connection charges, those are the impact fees, and the accrued guaranteed revenue charges. And all new customers of the water and wastewater system pay those capital connection charges and AGRCs. Now today, again, those fees are discounted 75%. We've at least assumed for this program that same discount would apply. So if we address this case sometime in the future again and those discounts no longer exist, the results would be different. But we're assuming that whatever we're doing for current development today, that we're going to extend that to Treasure Island as well. Separately, there are a couple cases where we looked at an additional assessment. It would still be one assessment number, but that would be looking at different levels of funding for the collection system in Eastside Forest Main that's applicable to Treasure Island. And those scenarios also take into consideration whether we have some grant revenues that we can apply towards the different cases. Slide 27 is a summary, a high-level summary of what those cases look like. So every single one of these has a minimum assessment component of $2,400 per connection. It's roughly $12 per month per customer to put it on a monthly basis, even though those assessments would be applied through the tax roll annually. Scenarios 4 through 6 are the ones that look at an additional special assessment where, and you can see this here, 25%, 25%, 50%, where the Treasure Island customers are picking up a portion of the local infrastructure costs that serve them. And we'll break that down in a little bit more detail for you here on the following slide. This is a summary of the total system cost. An easy way to understand how this table is working is really to look at Scenario 6. Scenario 6 deals with a 50% grant and 50% system costs. And so in that, there's $17.6 million for the Treasure Island collection system and allocated Eastside Forest Main. And so of that, in the second column, $8.8 million, 50% we're assuming will be funded from grants. The other 50% would be funded from the special assessment applied to Treasure Island customers. The result of that would leave a $0 allocation to OUA, to the remaining existing customers of OUA. So the Scenario 6 is a fully funded scenario where between the grants and the contribution by the Treasure Island customers, based on those, the Treasure Island system costs, there's not a direct exposure there to OUA. The number's 0 in that fourth column. Now, there is still $6.2 million in all of these cases that relates to the Eastside Forest Main that I mentioned before is applicable to new growth. So as you have new development out there in that area, you'll collect capital connection charges that will go towards offsetting the $6.2 million. But keep in mind that once this line is constructed, we will have principal and interest payments on that $6.2 million that becomes then part of the revenue requirements. And that's what we'll talk about in a little bit. So as we move forward from Scenario 6 up the scale, basically what we're identifying here as we move from Scenario 5 up to Scenario 1, I'll call it a subsidy, but it's basically the portion that the remaining OUA customers are picking up for the Treasure Island project. Under Scenario 5, again in the fourth column, is $4.4 million, $8.8 million under Scenario 4 and 3, $13.2 million under Scenario 2, and then $17.6 million under Scenario 1. And so Scenario 1 is where there's no grant revenue that's being applied to the project, and outside of that minimum special assessment, there's no additional special assessment that's going towards these Treasure Island system costs. Okay, so this is the criteria that we evaluate, and there's some footnotes there for your own edification. Looking at the customer responsibility, these are the special assessments. And again, we don't really intend to have two specific assessments. This is just how we broke out the math. The total assessments are in the third column for the different cases. As I pointed out, you can see every single one of them in column 1 has the 2402. So there will be some minimum assessment that's needed. And then scenarios 4, 5, and 6 pick up a select level of the overall remaining system cost. The annual assessment. Now, this also includes the discount. You know, if customers pay early, they get a roughly a 4% discount on their property taxes. So the special assessment will go through the property tax rolls, and there are certain collection costs for the property appraiser's office and other administrative fees. So these numbers here in that last column with footnote 3, it's a fully leveraged cost based on our current estimates that we have. If we broke it down into monthly numbers, scenarios 1 through 3 would be roughly $12 a month. Scenarios 4 and 5 would be roughly $21 a month. And then the last scenario would be $30 a month. Now, this is in addition to any sewer charges, monthly sewer charges that the customer will pay as well. We have some bill comparisons at the back of the presentation that will roll those numbers in for you. So comparing the results, again, as I mentioned to you opening, we're focused on cash flow, we're focused on cash balance, we're focused on debt service coverage compliance. And in the base case, it was cash balance. That was the cash balance and cash flow that was driving the results. Under the Treasure Island scenarios, it's really specifically tied to this debt service coverage, this minimum of the 120 target. And our timeline is so short. When you see the wastewater results, we only have wastewater rate increases for a 3-year period because we've got to get to a certain point by year 3 or we're no longer adequate, if that makes sense to you. So the first slide is just a projection of the rate increases that would be needed. We broke them out, water versus wastewater. Again, all the water scenarios are the same. We put them there just to be specific. They're tied to the base case, so all the water results are the same. Keep in mind, I'm going off memory, but we've got about half of the customers out there that are water only. So this is an important message in terms of that. You can see the different cases that we have. I think obviously our worst case is if we get no grant contribution and no additional contribution from the Treasure Island customers. That's our greatest exposure under Scenario 1. And you would need roughly a 6.3% rate increase for 3 years over the 3-year period. Again, nothing is shown for these cases in year 4 and 5 because you're adequate. You're over that 120% coverage hump, if you will. And so then no additional increase is required. All of these scenarios are tied to achieve similar cash flows, similar cash balances, and you're going to see that. So again, it really is the coverage constraint. Out of the different cases that we analyzed, Scenario 5 and Scenario 6 are the two that are equal to or better than the base case. And in this case, they're both better than. Scenario 5 ends up with a cumulative increase of 5.2% compared to 7.7% under the base case for the sewer bill. And then under Scenario 6, we're showing no wastewater rate increase under Scenario 6. Now, this is what I would call full freight. We're assuming that we're going to get a 50% grant for the project, and we're expecting that the Treasure Island customer is going to pick up their remaining 50% in the form of a 20-year assessment over a period of time. And again, we'll quantify those numbers to you of what that bill might look like. The debt service coverage, again, right in that 5th year, you can see we're right at 120% in these cases. We're having to modestly get there by the 3rd year, FY21, and again, that's what dictated what the shape of the wastewater rate adjustments on the previous slide. The next slide, 33, this is just the net answer. This is cash flow. And so you had a chart before where we had the expenses lined up with the revenues. This is just the net number. And so you can see the annual numbers from FY18 through 23, both for the base case all the way through Scenario 6. So most of them, we've got real dollars there, but for the most part, we're breaking even in our minds. I mean, if we're within roughly $100,000, we're pretty much breaking even. There is a cumulative total in the right-hand column. So cumulatively, your Treasure Island cases are adding a little bit of cash to the next 5-year period, with the exception of the base case, which uses about $216,000 in the operating reserves. And then scenario 6, which is de minimis, but about $53,000. Again, scenario 6 was the case where we showed no need for a sewer rate increase under that option. Slide 34, again, this is meant to just show you that there's some alignment between the scenarios and the base case. Scenario 1 through 6, these are the year-ended unappropriated cash balances. It includes all the funds, the restricted capital connection charges, as well as your emergency fund, your operating reserve fund. And you can see we're all playing in the same sandbox, especially by the time we get to the last year. $4.8 million for the base case. For scenarios 5 and 6, which were the more optimal Treasure Island cases, we're right around the same number, $5.1 million, $5 million. Again, it includes all the different funds you're meeting, all your debt service, not debt service, cash reserve policies. The next couple slides are bill comparisons, and I changed the color a little bit to help differentiate the two. The first slide on 35 is your residential water and wastewater bill. So this is everybody at large, system at large, using 4,000 monthly gallons per month. Now, what I can't tell you is how many customers that is specifically. But your average is somewhere between 4,000 gallons per month and 6,000 gallons per month for your system at large. Okay? Keep in mind, while I'm showing you one bill impact, everybody's result will be a little bit different, especially with your water-only customers. You're going to have commercial customers that are on the system. But again, the percentage rate increases are going to be applied uniformly. Everybody's going to see the same percentage. But these are dollar impacts. The base case, remember I told you earlier that the average was about $1.30 a month increase each year over the 5-year period. When you get down into your cases, again in fiscal year 22 and 23, all the numbers are the same because there is no sewer increase, just a water increase, but you can see the different adjustments. Again, scenario 5 and 6, years 19 through 21, again still looking at a $1.37 up to $1.44 per month increase. Under scenario 6, where again it's just water only, just under 60-cent increase per month. Not to fail to mention that the scenario 6 there does represent your water only bill at 4,000 gallons a month. So again, that's just under a 60-cent increase under the base case. The next two slides are the Treasure Island cases. And the monthly impact due from the bill is shown in the center of the page, FY 18 through 23. And again, keeping in mind that these are water customers today. So they're already paying a water bill. And we are adding a wastewater bill. I believe I failed to mention this in a previous slide, so I want to make sure I mention this now. When we're talking about the Treasure Island customers and service becomes available, we're going to have some customers that will connect to the system, and they're going to pay a sewer base charge as well as the volume charges, at whatever the stated resolution is at that time. A customer that does not connect is still subject to the monthly sewer base charge. And so that's important to know. So if we do one of these Treasure Island scenarios, we've got the minimum assessment that we talked about. That applies for any scenario that we have. Scenario 4 through 6 has a slightly higher assessment that picks up some system costs that they're going to benefit from. And then in addition to that, at a minimum, everybody's going to pay a minimum monthly sewer base charge. And these policies apply through your system throughout when people have service. And then those that do connect will actually pay a variable charge. So with that said, slide 36 is the base case compared to scenario 1, 2, and 3. 4, 5, and 6 are on the next slide. You're seeing the monthly bill impacts from FY 18 through 23. And there is a step in 21 as that sewer bill comes on. Now, what we did for the special assessment is we moved it to the right-hand margin. It's a 20-year assessment from FY 21 through 40 is what we've assumed. This is the full average that includes the tax collector's costs and so forth. So it's a fully burdened charge. The reason I didn't put that under the monthly bill is I don't want any confusion. The assessment is not going to be billed monthly. It's not going to show up on the utility bill. It will be on the property tax record. But we thought it'd be helpful for this discussion, and I know y'all have had previous discussions about the average monthly impact to the customer. And since a lot of your customers may be homeowners who may put this money aside in an escrow, to some degree there really is a monthly impact for them. But not everybody's doing the escrow. And then I left the base case up there at the top for comparison. But then we have scenarios 4, 5, and 6 on slide 37. Under these cases, of course, too, you'll see that the monthly assessment increased just slightly for 4 and 5, and then 6, as the Treasure Island customers assumed to pick up some of the system costs. In summary, when we look at the system, especially recognizing that the budget that's been adopted today and the previous year, we know was adopted with the knowing that we'd have to use reserves to fund the capital expenditures. I think the question out there is, how long do we have to operate in that condition? And that's part of what we think the financial forecast helps tell us. Is what we're trying to do in terms of the capital plan is look at, okay, when are we getting away from these one-time hurdles that we're having to address, and what's the best way to fund them? Should we debt finance them? Do we have the cash reserves to do that? And so that's what we worked in tandem with staff to do, is to try and strip out the one-time projects, fund them with reserves where we had them, okay, and that's why we used the rate stabilization fund. So that fund's really being used to help keep rates lower. Otherwise, we'd have to finance some of those costs, and rates would go up over time. And so then the other piece of what was remaining when we did that was that $500,000 per year in capital that we were funding from those ratepayers. And that's around slide 12 when you go back and look at this. So that's what we've tried to do is figure out, okay, when do we get beyond this hurdle, and then what is our overall revenue need at that point? So over the 5 years, we think the revenue need is around 7%. If we don't do any other expansion projects or anything like that. So just business as usual, we think we have some exposure around 7%. Whether the board decides to look at that in a stepped increments, that could all change. But we do see a need out there. And we do think that the need is going to be sooner than later due to your covenant compliance on your junior lien debt. And again, you'll know that because in your budget document, that's one of the factors that Mr. Gall and Mr. Haver tie to in your budget document is that 120%. Again, scenarios 1 through 6, the optimal appeared to be scenario 5 and 6, where in both of those cases we're getting at least a 50% grant contribution to the overall project cost, and we're collecting a little bit more in an assessment from the Treasure Island customers for their collection costs. There are some detailed slides in the back for your own need. I don't know that we necessarily need to go in those today, but it's what are the project costs, what are the on-site charges that we're collecting in the $3.6 million that we were talking about before. So it's some of the details. Again, I think those schedules will be helpful as the project matures and you want to look back and see what some of those specific assumptions were. But with that, that's our presentation and our recommendation.
My gosh, but I guess we're all still waiting on the grants to see where we're going to go. You've given us a big picture of what the scenarios are. Any questions for?
Very thorough. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. I love a lot. Okay. We appreciate it, sir. Thank you very much. We'll see you again. All right. Normal business. Agenda item number 12, the purchase of a zero-turn mower.
Mr. Chairman, board members, you have in your packages there agenda item number 12. That in the FY18 budget, there was an allocation to purchase a mower for the maintenance department, primarily to be able to mow around their facility and on the adjoining 10-acre parcel that used to be the Flores Nursery. In the FY18 budget, there was an allocation of $7,350 to purchase this mower. The staff looked at the Florida Sheriff's Association public bid, and they had a line item in there for bidding a mower, if you will, at this level. The lowest bid was submitted by Butch's Tractor Depot for Kubota at $6,500. To supplement those purchase or that bid item, the minimum threshold for the mower, the specifications were provided to several local vendors and asked them to supply their quotes for that same similar mower. And you can see those attached. If we did receive a bid, those are attached there in your bid package. This bid item, I should say. Again, Butch's, just as a background, they were the company that we purchased a mini excavator from last year out of off the same type of bid item, the Florida Sheriff's contract.
What are we using now, John? Is it just worn completely out?
I don't know the exact year, but it was a small tractor, a small push hog mower that came over when the OUA was created in 1995. That's what they're using now to do this mower.
95?
Yes, sir. Well, you know what year it is? So it's seen better days.
Okay. Didn't get any response from Gilbert Dixie Chopper, huh?
No, sir.
Does this include any maintenance or anything?
Sir?
Does this include any maintenance or anything? This price?
I mean, just other than the 1 year, the warranty that comes with purchase of a new product, but there's no maintenance agreement.
In our prior purchase from Fudge's, were they responsive to any requests we had about the excavator? Any questions, concerns? Did you?
No, sir. They came down, delivered it, gave us a walkthrough on how to operate it, and as far as I'm understanding, there has not been any issue with that yet.
And you, as Mr. Hafer, the director of this whole program, is happy with their service?
Oh, yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
So we did not opt for the optional upgrade for the diesel. It's a gas unit.
That is correct.
That would have been another $5,000 to put the diesel up, if I understand that.
That would have been an upgrade cost, yes, sir.
All right.
What's the pleasure of the board? Motion to approve.
Mr. Fadley, motions to approve the,
Purchase of the zero-turn mower.
from
And
Butch
that's
Tractor.
from the Butch's Tractor Depot.
That's correct.
Motion by Mr. Fadley.
Second.
Second by Mr. Nelson. Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Proposed go. All right, agenda item number 13, purchases of vehicles.
Mr. Chairman, board members, in the original FY18 budget, there was allocations for the purchase of several vehicles, those shown there in your budget item. The maintenance department, which uses a truck with a utility body, crane utility body in the back, primarily used for lifting and removing submerged pumps from our wastewater pump stations, but it can be used for other purposes. The administration director of operations vehicle is up for replacement, and a meter reader vehicle also up for replacement. In looking at their current allocation, there was another truck that has spent more time in the repair shop than one was anticipated when we put this budget together last summer, and that was used for the locate person that drives around and does all the locates. We're spending more money and time in the shop than it is on the road, and so we would like to be able to throw that in as a consideration. To that end, we went back to the Florida Sheriff's Association bid, and looked at the bid items referenced here, bid items 46, 50, and 7, looking at those bid specifications for those vehicles and looking at who the apparent low bidder was for those vehicles. And you can see a tabulation of those bid items in your package for those specific bid items. Again, as a comparison, we took the minimum specifications for that respective bid item, whether it was 46, 50, or 7, and supplied those to several local vendors of those vehicles and asked them to provide a quotation, and you can see those attached also.
The only thing that jumps out at me that I missed until you just gave your report is the maintenance vehicle that's unbudgeted, which you said we might take into consideration. Where are we? Do you have a proposal on that? Or?
That consideration would be either out of the budget. They had allocated some monies towards another piece of equipment, a front-end loader, for the maintenance department's use primarily in the construction aspect. Our construction services department is under consideration that in lieu of buying that item, that we would allocate those monies that were budgeted for this maintenance truck, and we would defer the purchase of the loader until next budget year.
Can you bring that back to us when you get a proposal on a new vehicle, or you have the money budgeted, but the maintenance department locator truck, you go get a price before you purchase, or?
That's included in here.
It is included. I missed it somewhere in here. So.
I believe that was going to be tied into 46, bid item 46. If you look at the first table, it says maintenance department locator truck and meter reader truck, specification number 46, a half-ton regular cab pickup truck, 4x2.
Okay, I just missed it.
And that bid item for that truck, just from the Florida Sheriff, is $18,182. On the next tab, the Director of Operations truck is through AutoNation, Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, Ram at $20,398. But with the added feature of the cargo box, it would raise that price to $21,692. And for the crane body truck, the relative bid came through from Isuzu, and with the base price of the truck, outriggers, and then to move the crane from our existing truck and install it on the new one, it came up with a total price of $58,927. If you look at those three prices off of if you compare to the first page, where you can see what we had budgeted, you can see that all of these bids came in lower than the budget amount that was in the bid item.
These vehicles that are in operation now, are they in any shape to be deemed surplus where we can sell them, or are they done?
If you remember from a past board meeting, we were talking about the current crane truck that is parked, has again spent a lot of time in the service bay. That vehicle, as well as all the replacement vehicles, would be brought back to the board once we receive the new vehicles, at which time you could deem them as surplus and they would be put out for sale. There would be 4 vehicles.
They're not ready to go to the scrapyard there.
Well, when we get the replacements in, then we would bring those back as surplus and we would put them out for sale.
What's the board's pleasure?
John, is it your recommendation we purchase the trucks?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Conley, do we need one bid for all, one motion for all three, or each motion?
I think it's clearer if you do it separately.
Okay, that actually would be for 4 vehicles, right?
Yes, sir, I can walk you through if you want. If you look at the first tabular table, It is for the locator truck and/or a meter reader truck. It would be for 2 vehicles, and that would be purchased through Garber, Chrysler, Dodge trucks for the half-ton regular cab truck. There would be 2 vehicles. Their purchase price is $18,182 for 2 vehicles.
We'll take that as the first one.
Yeah, this is a motion to purchase the 2 vehicles described by Mr. Hayford.
Motion by Mr. Fedlin,
Second.
by Mr. Nelson, discussion on the vehicles, on the motion, I'm sorry. Being none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
The next vehicle would be, if you turn the page, for the Director of Operations truck, a 4-door crew cab. Again, this one we purchased through Automation Truck, Chief Graham. Again, based upon the Florida Sheriff's Association bid, the total price with the cargo system was $21,692.
Motion to accept the bid of Automation for $21,692.
Motion by Mr. Nelson,
Second.
second Mr. Fedlin. Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
The next item and final item is the maintenance department cab and chassis along with the bed for the crane mount. It again is best based upon Florida Sheriff's Association bid specification number 7. The winning bid with the addition of the outriggers and the installing of the OUA crane was at $58,927 and was submitted by the Zuzu Truck of Ocala.
I had a question on that one. Just from the paperwork here, it looks like the Chevrolet trucks were both cheaper. Why is the Isuzu the winning bid?
If you look under that bid table, they could not supply the crane body. So if you look at either the 14-foot long flat body, it's blank, as well as the 16-foot. In the lowest bid, they came in around $11,000. Plus, they could not give me a bid for outriggers or to install the crane. So their bids do look less, but they are not as inclusive as the Ocala truck bid.
Okay.
It's a little misleading there, sorry about that, but they could not provide those numbers to me.
Okay.
Well, after Mr. Hayford's explanation, I motion to accept the bid from Isuzu for the tilt cabin chassis.
Motion, Mr. Fedlin.
Second.
Second, Mr. Nelson. Any discussion? I just have one thing. Do we have a Isuzu dealer or maintenance department around here or something that should go back, or do we have to send it back to Ocala?
We would have to send it out of town somewhere. I don't know that it would, I believe, I'd have to check, it might be Fort Pierce.
Fort Pierce
would be the
or West
locals.
Palm.
Okay, so it's relatively local. It's not going back home to get.
There is not one in town, that is for sure. I can tell you that a local dealer is going to be qualified within a time period, 6 months, sometime, that will be able to actually bid on this if we were to do it again, but they are not set up to deal with this particular truck at this time.
Any further discussion on the motion? Being none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. The only thing I have to decide now is what color.
Sir?
The only thing I have to decide now is what color you want.
White, unimaginative, white truck.
All right, agenda item number 14, fire hydrant installation.
Mr. Chairman, board members, it has been brought to the attention of the OUA board that there are some areas in our water distribution system that do not include fire hydrants. Again, it's something that we know about, but we are somewhat limited in the sense that many of these water mains do not meet the minimum threshold of 6 inches, which is typically required for the installation of a fire hydrant. Again, working through our own internal staff and working with some folks at the different fire departments, there was a request made that if we could put a fire hydrant on a smaller main, 4-inch, 3-inch, that they might be able to develop the minimum flows necessary to meet the ISO fire protection needs, of which I said that we would be willing to at least try it in one area to see what those flows are. So you have attached to you the estimated price for us to install a fire hydrant at around $3,600. An area has been chosen in Taylor Creek Isles on 27th Street as a test. Once we get it installed on this 3-inch water main, we will actually conduct some fire flow tests to see if it meets the minimum threshold. So it's certainly staff recommendation that this cost of $3,600 be paid for out of the fire hydrant fund, again, which is established with a minimum payment per bill every month that is set aside for fire protection needs, whether that is a hydrant installation or upsizing of mains to be able to provide fire protection in the system.
John, comparatively, how does this fall in with a normal fire hydrant? Is it more expensive to do the smaller one, or is it about the same?
The minimum cost is roughly about the same. Of course, it's always a function of what size is the supply line. If you can picture a 6-inch water main, that cost to tie in is not going to be the same as a 12-inch or 24-inch pipe, because the tap, if you will, of the line is going to be much more expensive. But the bare minimum cost is around $3,500 to $4,000. And again, it all depends upon where the main is. Are we going to have to cut up sidewalk or asphalt? I mean, that all adds to the cost.
So the test site, there's actually people at risk of not having a fire hydrant there, fires and things?
That is correct, yes, sir.
John, you've got a comment that the concern is the fire truck connection could damage the water main because it's larger than the connection for the...
Yes, ma'am. If you picture the typical fire hydrant, there's a 4.5-inch pumper nozzle in the middle. And if we provided that on this fire hydrant and attached the pumper truck to it, when it draws the water out, it might damage these smaller mains because there just isn't enough water there to meet the demand of the pumper truck. So the picture that we gave you there is a fire hydrant that does not have that pumper nozzle in the middle. It only shows the 2.5-inch hose nozzles on either side that they can connect fire hoses up to, but not the truck.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
So if they wanted to hook to the truck, they'd have to put an adapter on it, wouldn't they?
Well, they would have to use the smaller openings, which would then hopefully prevent them from damaging the
So
pipe.
couldn't get the volume through that smaller opening.
Yeah, but typically they would just connect fire hoses to this and then let it go, let the system pressure actually develop or get the water to the fire.
John, let me ask you one question, because you say current regulatory requirements state that a 6-inch diameter water main is the minimum. Will this violate any regulatory directive?
It won't violate what I have to go by, the DEP requirements. What it may be, what the question that I asked was, is it going to actually benefit the fire department or meeting their ISO regulations, which dictates, and the response that I received back was that if it meets the flow requirements, it doesn't matter, it won't impact. In other words, if the ISO says that they need 250 gallons a minute and we can get 300 gallons a minute, then we meet their requirements.
In other words, you're telling me there's a regulation, but there's an exception to the regulation.
The regulation, as I read it, was if we were installing new water mains now with fire hydrants, the minimum size that is suggested is 6-inch. This is an existing water main.
Correct. And
going back and doing rehab work, and it's not necessarily covered by that.
Okay.
So in this particular case, it falls within the Okeechobee Fire Department's area, and they have been appraised of this, and they're in favor of us making this attempt to see if this hydrant does benefit the community or the area.
Okay. Do you want to put a fire hydrant in?
I think we should put a fire hydrant in.
Okay, motion, Mr. Finley.
I'll second.
Second, Ms. Anderson. Further discussion? Being none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried.
Please let us know how the test turns out. That'd be very interesting.
All right, agenda item number 15, annual maintenance contract, OUA elevated storage tanks.
This is being brought back to the board. If you remember back, I think it was your November meeting, there was a notice that we were looking through the annual contract that, as it was provided to the OUA many years ago. There were some issues on automatic price escalations in the contract, along with, if you will, a failure to respond to requests that were being made for documentation with that company. The board exercised staff recommendation. The board authorized the issuance of a notice that we were going to be canceling the policy with the utility service company. In the meantime, since that occurred, staff has met with both utility service company as well as other companies that provide this service, more specifically American Tank Maintenance Company. And again, through the review of those meetings, the results, you have included in your board package an agreement provided by American Tank Maintenance to take over the annual inspections and maintenance of our 2 elevated water storage tanks. Again, just for mentioning it, there are 2 elevated storage tanks left in our system, one in Treasure Island and one in Buckhead Ridge, both constructed about the same time. I believe it was the mid-60s, both of them about the same size, 75,000 gallons.
I've got a curious question on that. Why is there a difference? The tanks are so similar. Why are there different amounts on these?
The only difference in the cost can be attributed to a minor difference in the construction of the tank. I believe one of the tanks has a few more internal spars or ribs, which requires a little bit more work on the sandblasting and painting during any kind of coating or paint touch-up. Okay, as if you did here, George, there is a difference in the surface area of the tanks.
Okay, I didn't know. I was just curious. Does the installation of any radio equipment on them have any bearing on the maintenance cost?
It would normally, but both companies have looked at the tank. I believe there is a tower, there is a radio antenna on the Buckhead Ridge Tower. I believe the one on the Treasure Island Tower has since been removed. If we were to go back, obviously, and add other features up there, that would change the maintenance contract to a certain extent, because they'd have to work around those items. But just for general knowledge, we do not have things that would be quite extensive, like cell phone antennas and things of that nature that would be very problematic. I think the antenna on the Buckhead Ridge Tower was for like a ham or radio operator for emergency purposes. It's a relatively small antenna. The only other difference, the Buckhead Ridge Tower does have lights on top of it, and the Treasure Island does not have any lights.
The other thing is, in the future, if we're asked by certain companies to add additional equipment to the towers, that will impact the cost on these contracts.
It very well could, yes, sir.
We ought to keep that in mind,
Yes, sir.
I guess.
We are completely clear of USC cancellations done, where your contract's going to finish today.
That is correct. That contract has been canceled. They obviously are very eager to continue the working relationship with us, but again, they've had a little bit of an issue with their automatic escalation, and where they're at pricing-wise. It's a little bit more than American Tank Maintenance. Now, clearly, we do have a long-term working relationship with utility service company. We know a little bit about them and where they're at. The new company, we do not have that long-term working environment with them, and we were just relegated by calling some of their references to ask those utility operators what their experiences have been with American Tank.
Did utility service give any reason for failure to respond when we were trying to get a hold of them?
The response to that was there were some medical issues, I guess, with some of the people, hip surgery or hip replacement, or, there was just some kind of internal, if you will, error within their company that they said they have since rectified, and that should be behind them.
I'd like to add that if you compare the two contracts, the language in the American Tank Maintenance contract is much more favorable. There's no requirement on 90 days notice before the end of the contract if you want to terminate it. And based on the reference checks, everybody was pleased with them. I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, they all rated them 9 or 10 on the 6 calls that I made. Actually, one of them rated them on 11.
Must have been a grandson of the owner. Kidding.
Well, like with any references, they're going to send you the best references, of course. So that's what we have to go by. So again, I would only caution that there is up until recently, there is a proven track record with USC, but like things happen, they were unresponsive at times. They do have this automatic escalation clause in their older contract, and so the question is, we did what we could do as far as our due diligence to check references, and certainly that's why we're presenting the American Tank Maintenance contract for review.
We're sitting here right now with no maintenance contract on those towers, and we need to do a maintenance contract.
Well, there are requirements, obviously. The maintenance is something that would be built in, and that's obviously the flushing and the cleaning and the long-term painting, both of the interior and exterior. The other issue that we do have to deal with, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection does require them to be certified by a certified inspector every 5 years. That will be coming up. Of course, the unknown is if we do have a problem in the short term, we're not qualified to climb the towers anymore and go up and fix it. So we do not have somebody on staff to be able to do that.
Okay, so you're the board.
I make a motion that we accept the contract from ATM to do the maintenance of the Buckhead Ridge and Treasure Island elevated water tank at this time.
Motion by Mr. Nelson.
Second.
Second by Mr. Fagan. Further discussion?
And just for clarification, that would be approval or acceptance of the two different contracts for each, that would be
Correct.
He specified that.
He did.
Further discussion?
And that is the staff's recommendation, ATM.
Yes, sir.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Agenda item 16, public comment. Where are you moving? Hi, Phil. Items from the attorney. Mr. Thomas.
I guess I will take this one, John. At the last meeting, the direction was to move forward on the 3 parcels of property that were declared to be surplus. We dealt, the chairman and John and I sat down with the auctioneers, looked at proposals, and a contract was submitted in order to get this wheel running. I know the board was polled, and an auction agreement was signed with one of the auction companies, Elliott Paul and Company. I would ask the board to formally approve and ratify the execution of the auction agreement because the auctioneer's already gone to work under the terms of this agreement. I'd like it formalized at a meeting here so that we don't have an auditor problem later. Since it's not been approved by official meeting of this board, I would recommend you approve the auction agreement and ratify the execution of it by the chairman.
So motion.
All right, the motion is to execute the auction agreement, and have the executed, correct?
It's to approve and ratify it. Approve and ratify the execution.
So motion.
Second by Mr. Nelson. Questions, discussion, all in favor?
Aye.
Carries.
I think that's the only thing I need to talk to you about right this minute from the legal department.
I was hoping for a settlement already on something else, but I guess we're just.
Still pending.
Keep it on. All right, Mr. Hager.
Just to follow up on the auction, if the board remembers, we originally projected a sale date of February 24th. There was an issue of going through trying to ask the county or the city or the school board whether they had properties, surplus properties that they wanted to add. At one time there were some, but at the end of the day, there were none. When the auctioneers started working on this, they thought they needed more time if there were going to be some additional properties. So it was decided that we would move that, push the date back from the 24th to March 3rd. And so the public auction is slated here in this room, March 3rd, for these properties. I have sent to each of you a YouTube video of that advertisement for the properties, which is a pretty nice little presentation. So he has started with both the print media as well as electronic media advertising this sale on March 3rd. The only other pressing thing I did mention that there would be pending a water main installation on Northwest 30th Avenue. I did want to get to you where we stand with that there were 6 residents on that road that had agreed to connect to the system if we were to put it in. Following the past procedures, we quoted to them the cost of a 2-inch water main and their prorated share of that water main. And they also provided to you the estimated cost for the construction, which would include a segment of 6-inch water main so that we can put a fire hydrant down on the property and then extend the water main to the end with a 2-inch water main. And that cost is roughly, included here, is a little over $39,560 is the estimated cost. Whereas if we were to move forward with this project, those funds would be allocated out of the budget item that's in the budget for new water main installation. That budget item was around $150,000, and we've already allocated some of those funds to a previous project that was on Northwest 37th Avenue. We would then allocate around $40,000 out of the remaining $100,000 for this project. The board will either consider that at this board meeting, or I can bring it back to another agenda for this board meeting.
The residents have agreed to pay not only the standard connection fee, but also would pay the proportionate share of the water main. They've already agreed to pay it.
Well, they obviously haven't signed, monies, and there wasn't, one of the residents out there who was very eager to have it done, walk the street and talk to folks, and there was a total of 6 of the houses that said that they would agree, again, not with the standard fees, which are the capital connection charges, AGRC, but they would pay their share of the estimated cost for a 2-inch water main, which turned out to be a little over $500, I think.
$678.28.
$678.
Which side of the street are you, I'm looking at the picture, you're looking at Northwest 30th Avenue?
Northwest 30th Avenue.
Which side of the street are you talking about? I'm trying to count the residences.
West side, sir. There are some of the homeowners who have not agreed at this time to connect to the system.
Are you counting on both sides of the street?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Well, what would the board like to do? Act on this today, or do we want to put it off till next month?
I think we should act on it today. We've already been through it once.
I concur with you. I think we should just go ahead and do it.
You need a motion on it?
Yes.
I move that we accept staff's recommendation to install the water main on Northwest 30th Avenue and all components there are, and fund it directly from the budget item for that purpose,
With the contribution from the,
with the contribution from the residents that have agreed to
contributors.
yeah.
Motion by Ms. Anderson.
Second.
Second with Mr. Martin. Further discussion? Being none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
And again, just for purposes, we have almost completed the application for the SRF funding for Treasure Island. That will be going in shortly. Again, it's just an application to get the process started. It does not lock us into anything, but at least we can try to start getting feedback from the SRF folks as to the availability of funds and where we will be with that project, if we elected to move forward with it. Other than that,
Thank you,
we're
sir.
just waiting on the budgetary process to finish in Tallahassee and those pending issues with the main office rehab and things like that. We can get a clearer picture as to what's happening in the coming year.
Thank you, sir. Any items from the board? Being none, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion and second, all in favor? Aye. We're out. Thank you, everybody. See you next month. Unless you're not doing anything on the third, we'd like to come by and bid on some property.